In the palace of Colville, cruelty never needed to raise its voice. It only needed paperwork. For 6 months, Lord Vincent Morgan had been quietly rewriting a marriage into a crime, forging the king's own seal, burning pleas before they were ever read, and teaching an entire court that silence meant guilt. Somewhere beneath the chapel floor, sealed away in 6 missing boxes, lay the proof of a husband who never stopped fighting to be heard. But on the morning a stubborn refusal shattered the routine, the lie Morgan built for months began cracking in real time, and one desperate accusation was about to decide everything. What exactly was Vincent Morgan trying to hide, and why was he willing to burn a king's own marriage to keep it buried? Stay with us to find out. Settle in for the story of Elliot Parker, the palace's most unwanted husband, who answered his first royal summons by simply refusing to get out of bed. If you've ever fantasized about getting just one day to order everyone around like actual royalty, tell us about it in the comments below. The last thing I saw as Noah Bennett was a boba tea flying in slow motion out of my hand, tapioca pearls scattering across the crosswalk on SW Broadway like a very sad confetti cannon, while a silver Tesla that definitely ran the red light took the rest of me with it. I remember the specifics with an unfairness usually reserved for embarrassing memories, not fatal ones. The particular gray of the Portland sky, flat and low the way it always was in October. The smell of wet asphalt, and underneath it the ridiculous brown sugar sweetness of the drink, still clutched in my hand a half-second before impact. The chime from my phone, a work Slack notification, of all things, some project manager asking if the Sprint Retro could move to Thursday, vibrating uselessly in my pocket while my body left the ground. 27 years old, I thought, watching the sky spin, weirdly calm about it. The way you're calm about things that are happening too fast to be real yet. Never finished season 3 of that show. Never told my mom I loved her enough. Died over brown sugar boba. Fitting, honestly. Portland would go on without me. The rain would keep falling on my empty apartment, on the sad little herb garden I'd killed twice and was trying a third time, on the guitar I never learned to play properly propped in the corner of my bedroom. My cat— no, wait, I didn't have a cat. I'd meant to get one. That was almost sadder than the dying part, the fact that my last conscious thought involved regretting a pet I never adopted. Then there was nothing, which lasted either 4 seconds or 400 years, dark and weightless and strangely unafraid, like floating in a pool at night. And then there was light again, and cold stone under my back, and the sharp tang of beeswax candles and old parchment filling a set of lungs that weren't quite mine yet. The first sensation I actually registered, before I even opened my eyes, was weight. My own body had never felt this solid, shoulders too broad for the mattress, hands too large, a heartbeat thudding slow and steady in a chest that took up more room in the world than mine ever had. Whoever I'd woken up as, he was built like he'd spent a lifetime doing something more physical than debugging code at 2 a.m. Then there was a gold-sealed letter shoved into my hands by a woman in an apron, so starched it could have stopped a knife. "His Majesty has summoned you," she said. "You are already late." I blinked at her. I blinked at the room, stone walls, a fireplace big enough to roast a whole cow, velvet curtains I was the dried wine, and for post bed I was apparently lying in, wearing a nightshirt with actual lace on the cuffs. Not my apartment, not my Portland, not, as far as I could tell, my century. I looked down at my hands, bigger than mine, calloused across the knuckles in a way that suggested sword practice, not keyboard shortcuts. On the left one sat a heavy gold ring, engraved with 2 wolves circling a crown. A mirror across the room showed me a stranger, tall, broad through the shoulders, dark hair a mess from sleep, a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone with a grudge against softness, handsome, in an off-duty Viking sort of way. Definitely not me. Definitely, according to the plaque of a title stitched into the nightshirt in gold thread, Royal Consort, husband to His Majesty the King. Well, I said out loud, to nobody, that escalated. Elliot Parker, the body I now occupied. Alpha, late 20s, Royal Consort of the Kingdom of Colville. According to the fading terror in every servant's eyes, a man whose reputation had been thoroughly, systematically ruined. Mrs. Agatha Whitmore, 50s, head steward of the East Wing, ran the household with the warmth of a filing cabinet and the loyalty of someone who'd learned, long ago, that surviving this palace meant never picking a side until it was safe to. The apron woman stood at the door with 2 younger servants behind her, one already holding out a robe so thin I could see my future frostbite through it. You'll want to hurry, Your Highness, Mrs. Whitmore said, in a tone that made hurry sound like a threat wearing perfume. His Majesty does not tolerate delay. Something in this body, some leftover muscle memory that wasn't mine, made my hands shake at that sentence. Fear that belonged to someone else, sitting in my new bones like a splinter. I have questions about ghosts and body ownership, and whether I still had a soul or just borrowed one. But I had exactly one instinct left over from 27 years of being Noah Bennett, and it was this. Never let anyone see you're afraid before your coffee. I didn't have coffee. I had a summons with a wax seal cracked down the middle like someone had pressed a thumb into it too hard, out of nerves. What happens, I asked, testing the water, if I don't go? The room went so still I heard the fire pop. Your Highness, Mrs. Whitmore said carefully, like she was talking a man off a ledge, should not joke. I'm not joking. I'm just annoyingly curious. Nobody answered. That, it turned out, was the answer. I looked past her at the little table by the bed, a stack of letters, unopened, addressed in the same careful, slightly desperate handwriting, some to His Majesty, some to nobody at all, a bowl of dried flower petals, most gone brown, one still faintly sweet. Evidence of a man who had spent months trying to be loved by someone who'd made ignoring him into a full-time royal policy. Whoever Elliot Parker had been, he'd tried. Hard, and it clearly hadn't worked. I had already died once, crossing a street for boba tea. I did not, apparently, have it in me to audition for anyone's affection a second time. Tell His Majesty, I said, pulling the blanket back over my legs, that I'm indisposed. You are not indisposed. I died recently. I'm counting it. The words came out before I could stop them, and every servant in the room froze. Not in confusion, but in fear, the specific fear of people who suspected their charge had finally, completely lost it, and weren't sure whether to call a doctor or a priest. Which is, of course, when the door burst open with the force of a man who had clearly never learned to knock. He filled the doorway the way weather fills the sky, not loud, exactly, but impossible to ignore. Black tunic, no crown, dark hair swept back like he hadn't had time to care, and eyes the pale, storm cloud gray of a man who'd learned young that showing feelings got you nothing but exploited. Adrian Blackwood, 29, Omega, King of Colville, the first Omega in 3 generations to hold the throne outright, which meant he had spent his entire life proving, to a court that never stopped testing him, that softness and sovereignty were not opposites. He did this mostly by being terrifying. You refused my summons, he said. No greeting, no hello, husband. Sorry I've ignored you for 6 months. Just accusation delivered like a verdict. I sat up straighter, mostly out of spite. Correction, I refused frostbite and a fashion crime. The robe they tried to put me in was basically a curtain with delusions. Every servant in the room inhaled at once, like I'd set the drapes on fire. The king's jaw ticked. For a second, one full, unguarded second, something crossed his face that wasn't fury. It looked almost like surprise, the way a man looks when a wall he's been leaning on for years turns out to be a door. You're being deliberately difficult, he said. I'm being appropriately dressed for the weather. There's a difference. You'd know that if you ever left your study long enough to check the temperature of the east wing, which, by the way, has no fire this morning. Funny how that happened right after I said no to something. He looked, for one heartbeat, like a man recalculating an equation that had suddenly stopped balancing. I'd like to say I planned that. I didn't. I was 27 years old, or however old Elliot's body was, some fresh flavor of whatever, furious on behalf of a man whose letters sat unopened on a nightstand, and mouthy enough that college professors used to write insubordinate but not wrong on my papers. Grief and jet lag from dying make you say true things you'd normally keep to yourself. The king's eyes moved once, slowly, over the cold hearth, the thin robe still draped over Mrs. Whitmore's arm, the untouched breakfast tray with its single dry heel of bread. His gaze came back to me last and lingered a beat too long, long enough that Mrs. Whitmore cleared her throat like she was trying to reboot the room. Fix this, the king said, not to me, to her. Fire lit within the hour, a proper breakfast. And someone find him a robe that isn't an insult. Mrs. Whitmore's mouth opened, then closed. Your Majesty, the household office determined. I did not ask what the household office determined. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Ice doesn't shout. It just sits there being colder than everything around it. I asked you to fix it. She bowed so fast her spine nearly cracked and swept out, dragging the other servants with her like a bride's train made entirely of nerves, which left the king and me, alone, in a bedroom, with a wedding ring between us that neither of us had chosen. He looked at me the way you look at a puzzle piece. That's the wrong shape for the box it came in. You're not yourself today, he said quietly. You have no idea, I thought. Out loud, I said, maybe you never met me on a day I wasn't being pushed into something. Something shifted behind his eyes, not warmth, nothing that generous, but interest, sharp and unwilling, like a man noticing a locked door he'd walked past 100 times without trying the handle. He didn't answer. He turned and left, and the wake of his cologne, cedar and rain, absurdly, unfairly good, lingered in the room a full minute after the door shut. I flopped back against the pillows and stared at the ceiling. Great, I told the empty room. I died, got reincarnated as a scandal, and I have a crush on the man responsible for the scandal. Cosmic sense of humor, truly. Grief, I was learning, made you either very quiet or very talkative, and apparently dying twice in 24 hours, once for real, once socially, had tipped me firmly into the second category. I spent the rest of that morning interrogating every servant brave enough to linger in my doorway, piecing together the shape of the life I'd inherited the way you'd assemble furniture with half the instructions missing. Elliot Parker, it turned out, had been a merchant's son from the coastal town of Ashford Cove, married into the crown 8 months earlier under circumstances nobody wanted to discuss above a whisper. A political match, forged in the aftermath of a border skirmish with the neighboring Duchy of Vale, meant to bind two feuding houses with a ring instead of a treaty. Nobody had asked either groom whether he wanted it. Adrian had been 28 and furious about losing a decade of careful diplomatic maneuvering to a stranger's bloodline. Elliot had been 26, and according to every account I could drag out of a servant, hopeful, in the specific, doomed way of a man who believed that if he simply tried hard enough, an arranged marriage might still turn into a real one. It hadn't. And the palace, bored, cruel in the particular bureaucratic way institutions get when nobody's watching closely enough, had turned his hope into a running joke. Jamie Collins, 19, a palace page assigned to my wing. Lanky, easily startled, and, I would come to learn, one of the very few people in this building who still had a conscience he hadn't been talked out of yet. He used to leave flowers on the king's desk, Jamie admitted quietly, refilling my tea with hands that had finally stopped shaking quite so badly. Every week, fresh ones. The gardeners started charging him extra because Lord Morgan's office kept losing the receipts. Let me guess, the flowers never made it to the desk. Jamie's silence was answer enough. I looked down at the ring on my finger, heavier than it had any right to be for a piece of jewelry, and felt something settle into place that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, more like the specific, focused fury of a man watching someone kick a dog that couldn't kick back. Okay, I said, mostly to myself. New rule, no more flowers on desks. If this body's going to get a reputation, it's getting a fun one. Your Highness, you'll see. I spent the next hour doing recon disguised as boredom, wandering the halls in a robe that actually fit correctly, thanks to Mrs. Whitmore's grudging follow-through, cataloging exits, kitchens, and the general layout of a palace that clearly wanted me lost and humble. I found the kitchens by smell alone, warm bread and wood smoke cutting through the marble chill, and made fast, chaotic friends with a baker named Old Tomas, who slipped me a heel of fresh loaf and didn't ask a single question about why the despised consort was grinning at him like Christmas had come early. I found the library next, cavernous, dusty, criminally under-visited, and discovered, with the mean satisfaction of a man collecting ammunition, an entire shelf of court law dedicated to the rights of a royal consort. Rights that, as far as I could tell from the household's behavior, nobody had bothered enforcing in months. By the time the noon devotion summons arrived, folded and sealed and delivered by a guard who wouldn't meet my eyes, I wasn't scared anymore. I was, for the first time since waking up dead in someone else's spine, prepared. The fire came, eventually. So did breakfast. Actual food, fruit, tea that smelled like honey and something floral I didn't recognize. I ate every bite out of principle and mild disbelief, and told Jamie, who delivered it, that he'd earned himself a friend for life. You shouldn't say things like that, Jamie whispered, glancing at the door like it had ears. Which, in this palace, it probably did. The walls listen today. Then the walls can mind their business, I said, and he almost smiled before fear stamped it out. I didn't get long to enjoy my small victory. By noon, Whitmore returned with a robe so heavy it could double as a weighted blanket, white and gold, with a collar built to force my chin up whether I liked it or not. Behind her, a lacquered box held powder, tint, and a crystal bottle of perfume that hit my nose like a punch of sugared roses. "His Majesty dislikes that scent?" Mrs. Whitmore said with the closest thing to a smile I'd seen on her. "But tradition requires it for the noon devotion." There it was. Not punishment by cold this time. Punishment by performance. Dress me up, perfume me in something he hated, and put me on display so the whole court could watch him reject me in real time. And if I don't go, then everyone will say the consort is not merely neglected, he is disobedient. Her eyes sharpened. "Neglect earns pity, Your Highness. Disobedience earns consequences." I stood, letting the blanket fall. My legs, Elliot's legs, were steadier than they had any right to be, all lean muscle under soft skin. An alpha's build that some part of this body remembered how to use even if I hadn't caught up yet. "Fine," I said, reaching for the robe. "I'll attend." Her satisfaction was instant and smug. "Your Highness comes to his senses." I didn't say I'd kneel. Her face went blank in a way that was, frankly, one of the more satisfying things I'd witnessed since dying. The Amber Hall was exactly the kind of room built to make a man feel small. Gold, everything, stained glass throwing colored light onto marble, a court full of nobles who'd clearly RSVP'd yes to watch the king's husband grovel. The air smelled of hot wax and old incense, thick enough to taste, and my footsteps on the marble sounded absurdly loud in a room built for silence and spectacle in equal measure. Every eye tracked me from the doorway to the center of the floor, the specific attention of a crowd that had already decided how this story ended and simply wanted to watch it happen on schedule. In the center, below an empty throne, sat a velvet cushion worn thin in 2 spots from repeated use, and a silver cup that smelled, even from 10 feet away, like the perfume currently soaked into my collar. Someone had arranged fresh white lilies along the base of the dais, a small, cruel touch, since lilies, I'd learn later, were the flower Elliot used to leave on Adrian's desk. Even the decorations here were a joke at my expense. Beside the cup, a parchment, already written, waiting only for a signature. I, royal consort of His Majesty, humbly repent for my arrogance and beg forgiveness before the throne. I hadn't done anything. Neither, judging by the trembling, half-finished letters back in that nightstand, had the man whose body I wore. But the confession was ready anyway, because in this palace, guilt didn't require a crime, just a convenient husband. The Lord Steward of Rights stepped forward, staff in hand, smile polished enough to see your own doom reflected in it. Vincent Morgan, 50s, silver-haired, Lord Steward of Rights since the old king's reign. The kind of man who'd never raised his voice in his life because he'd never needed to. Paperwork did the shouting for him. A traditional gesture of loyalty, he said, after causing His Majesty such concern. Concern, I repeated. Is that what we're calling 6 months of silence and a cold breakfast? A ripple moved through the nobles, delighted the way people get delighted watching a car crash, in slow motion. I picked up the cup. The court leaned in, hungry for the familiar shape of the story. Poor, dramatic consort, kneeling again, begging again. I stepped toward the cushion. Then I stepped past it. The gasp that followed nearly knocked the stained glass out of its frames. "Your Highness?" Vincent Morgan said, smile cracking at the edges. "The cushion is there. I saw it. I'm not using it." I walked to the empty throne, set the cup on the first step, laid the unsigned confession beside it, and said, loud enough to carry, if His Majesty wants an apology, he can ask for one himself. The silence that followed was so total I could hear my own pulse. Then the great doors opened, and the entire hall dropped into a bow so fast it looked choreographed. I stayed standing. It was, I would later admit to absolutely no one, the single best decision I have ever made in either of my lives. King Adrian walked in wearing black, no crown, 1 silver signet ring catching the candlelight, and stopped 3 steps above the kneeling court, gaze sweeping the scene, the cushion, the cup, the unsigned confession, and finally, me, the only person in the room, still on my feet. Something moved behind his eyes, not anger, recognition, like he'd seen this exact trap before and never once questioned who'd built it. "You refused your king," he said. "I refused frostbite and bad styling. Twice? Apparently, since you're still bringing it up." A few nobles went pale. Vincent Morgan's smile thinned. The king descended 1 step, and the whole hall seemed to stop breathing with him. "Come with me," he said, and turned, not waiting to see if I'd follow. I followed. Mostly because the alternative was staying in a room where a man named Vincent had prepared my forgiveness in advance, in his own handwriting, for a crime I hadn't committed. His study smelled like parchment and rain-damp stone, a fire behind an iron screen, maps on every wall. He unlocked a drawer and dropped a black-corded bundle of papers on the desk between us like a challenge. "Records of your conduct," he said. Since the wedding, I stared at the stack. "You kept a file on me?" "The household kept it." I was sent copies. "Romantic," I said, and started reading before he could stop me. The consort attempted to force entry into His Majesty's chambers. The consort wept before the court and accused His Majesty of cruelty. The consort wore forbidden perfume during devotion, despite repeated warnings. Every entry, same tidy, unbothered handwriting. The same hand as the breakfast note. The same hand as the confession waiting on that cushion. My pulse changed from anger to something colder, recognition. I flipped faster, and near the middle of the stack, tucked behind a report about the forbidden perfume, I found it, a scrap of paper, folded so small it had nearly fused into the binding. The handwriting on it was nothing like the tidy reports, shaky, pressed hard enough to tear the page in 2 places. I never chose the perfume. The king went very still beside me. "Who told you I chose it?" I asked. His eyes moved to the scrap, then hardened. "Lord Morgan." I thought of the polished smile in the amber hall, the cushion worn thin in exactly 2 spots, and felt something in my chest. Elliot's chest, mine now, I supposed, twist with a grief that wasn't entirely my own. Somewhere under my ribs, a man who'd never gotten to finish a single sentence to his husband was finally being heard, 6 months too late, and through a stranger's borrowed mouth. "There are more," I said quietly, and started pulling every scrap free from every accusation. "They dressed me while I was ill. I waited because they locked my door. Please ask me once." 16 words, 5 scratched-out lines, a sentence so small it felt like a hand reaching up out of a grave. The king read them without breathing. When he finally looked up, the ice in his eyes had cracked clean down the middle. "Why?" he said, voice low. "Did no one bring this to me?" I looked at the unopened letters I'd seen that morning, the cold breakfast, the perfume he hated forced onto his husband over and over. "Maybe he tried," I said. "Maybe you just weren't the one reading the mail." We spent the better part of an hour after that just reading. Sitting on opposite sides of his desk like 2 students cramming for an exam neither of us had studied for, sorting reports into piles. Forged, real, unclear. The fire behind the iron screen popped and settled. Somewhere outside, a bell marked the changing of the guard, ordinary and distant, while the 2 of us quietly demolished 6 months of manufactured evidence 1 page at a time. "This one," Adrian said, sliding a report across the desk, "claims you threw a vase at a visiting duchess. Did I?" The duchess in question left the kingdom 11 months ago, before the wedding, so no, solid alibi. I was busy not existing yet. He almost smiled, the second near smile of the day, and I was, God help me, keeping count now, some ridiculous internal scoreboard I hadn't consented to. "You take this remarkably well," he said, "for a man reading a stack of lies about himself. I've had worse mornings." I didn't elaborate on the boba tea. Some things a medieval king wasn't emotionally prepared for. Also, in my defense, being furious on your own behalf is exhausting. Being furious on someone else's behalf is strangely energizing. Different muscle. He looked up at that, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "You keep speaking as though you are 2 different people." I froze for half a second too long. "I mean," I said, recovering fast, "waking up married to a man who hated me does tend to make a guy feel a little bit like a stranger in his own skin." Figure of speech. He studied me a beat longer than the excuse deserved, and I got the distinct, uncomfortable sense that Adrian Blackwood, cold, calculating, terrifyingly observant Adrian Blackwood, filed that reaction away for later instead of letting it go. Kings didn't get to survive coups and border wars by missing details. It was, I decided, both extremely inconvenient and extremely attractive, which felt like it should have been a contradiction and somehow wasn't. "Here," he said instead, sliding another page across, changing the subject with the graceless efficiency of a man who'd clearly never had to make small talk in his life. "Tell me if you recognize the hand." I leaned in to look. Our shoulders brushed. Neither of us moved away, which felt, at the time, like the single most dangerous political decision either of us made that day. More dangerous than the ledger, more dangerous than defying Vincent Morgan in front of the whole court. His cologne again, cedar and rain, close enough now that I could catalog the way it changed at this distance. Warmer, less formal, more him. "You smell like a forest after a storm," I said, before my brain could veto it. "It's deeply unfair, given the circumstances." He blinked. Actual, honest surprise, the kind that cracked all the way through the ice for a second. That is not the reaction most people have to discovering a conspiracy against them. I contain multitudes, I said, which, I would learn over the following months, was going to become something of a personal motto. Also, I stand by my point. It's rude. I'm trying to be righteously furious over here, and you're out here smelling like a forest. Adrian looked at me for a long moment, something warring behind his expression. Amusement, wariness, and underneath both unmistakably, interest. The kind an Omega King with a lifetime of guarding every reaction clearly hadn't planned on feeling for the husband he'd spent 6 months avoiding. "You are," he said finally, slowly, like he was testing the shape of the sentence before committing to it, not at all what the reports described. The reports were wrong about basically everything else. Feels consistent. That was when the bell started tolling, and the moment, whatever it had been building toward, got shoved aside by the much more pressing problem of an entire kingdom's council preparing to accuse me of witchcraft-adjacent crimes, which, in retrospect, might have been for the best. I don't know what either of us would have said next, and some conversations are better left half-finished until the stakes are lower and the room isn't quite so on fire, metaphorically or otherwise. We didn't get long to sit with that discovery, because someone always interrupts the good part. A guard arrived with a fresh order. The household office had restricted the consort's wing pending review of his conduct, sealed with a tidy red ribbon and written in the same polite bureaucratic language as every other cruelty that had been dressed up as procedure since I'd woken in this body. The king read it once, and the temperature in the room actually seemed to drop. "Unlock the wing," he said. "Restore the staff. If a single fire in that corridor goes out before sunset, whoever's responsible can explain it to me personally, as my husband is being treated worse than a prisoner in his own home. My husband. He said it the way you'd load a weapon. Not warm, not tender, purely tactical, and yet it landed somewhere soft and unguarded in my chest anyway, because apparently 6 months of unopened letters and one cold breakfast is exactly what it takes for an alpha's instincts to go, "Oh no, I like this insufferable man." He turned back to me, all business, and reached for the black key hanging from his belt. "The sealed ritual archive," he explained. "The one place Vincent Morgan wouldn't expect either of us to look, because I'd technically been forbidden from entering it since the wedding." "Convenient," I said. "You said that, not me." He set the key on the desk, not in my hand, between us. A choice, not an order, which, from a king who apparently ordered everything by reflex, felt like more of a gesture than flowers would have. I picked it up. Our fingers brushed for exactly 1 second too long, and neither of us commented on it, which somehow made it worse. Or better, I genuinely couldn't tell anymore. My emotional compass having been recalibrated by death and a very good-looking Omega monarch in the same 24 hours. "If we go," he said, "you don't leave my sight. Bold of you to think I'd wander off from the one interesting man in this entire palace." He looked, for exactly 1 heartbeat, like he didn't know whether to be offended or pleased. It was, I decided, a very good look on him. The sealed archive sat under the old chapel, behind a bronze door carved with kneeling figures. "Tasteful," I muttered, and the king almost smiled. The key turned in the lock with a groan like something waking up after a long, resentful nap, and cold air rolled out to meet us, thick with the smell of dust and old candle wax and paper, slowly turning to powder in the dark. Inside, shelves climbed higher than either of us could reach without a ladder. Record boxes stacked by year and ceremony and royal seal, generations of a kingdom's small cruelties filed alphabetically. Our footsteps echoed too loudly on the stone. Adrian took 1 row, I took the other, and for a while the only sound was the soft rasp of pages and the occasional muttered commentary I couldn't quite keep to myself. "Your grandfather," I said, squinting at a box labeled in faded ink. "Apparently fined a duke for wearing the wrong color to a funeral. There is an entire ledger for this. My grandfather had opinions about mourning etiquette. Your grandfather had too much time on his hands. You're one to talk. You spent an hour this morning interrogating my kitchen staff about pastry recipes instead of resting. That was reconnaissance, Adrian. Old Tomas is a wealth of palace gossip and an even bigger wealth of free bread. Priorities." He huffed something that wasn't quite a laugh, reaching past me for a box on a higher shelf, close enough that his sleeve brushed my arm, and for one absurd moment neither of us moved to correct the distance. Then his hand stilled on the shelf marked Consort devotions. 6 boxes missing, gaps in the dust where they'd clearly been pulled within the hour, and whatever softness had crept into the moment sharpened back into urgency. "They're ahead of us," he said quietly. "They're always ahead of us. That's the whole problem with Vincent Morgan. Guy plans like he's got a spreadsheet for treachery." I crouched by the brazier in the corner, still glowing faint orange with fresh ash, and felt my stomach drop. "And he's close. This fire's maybe 20 minutes old. Someone had beaten us there. Someone always did, in stories like this one." A scrape sounded behind the far shelves. The king moved in front of me, fast instinct overriding manners, and I put a hand flat against his chest, gentle, and said, Don't turn me into something you hide behind." He froze. Then, slowly, he stepped sideways instead, until we stood shoulder to shoulder. Which, for a king who apparently ordered fires lit and staff dismissed with the same clipped tone, felt like an enormous concession. The shape behind the shelves turned out to be a terrified young clerk, ink-stained cuffs, knees hitting the floor before either of us said a word. Milo Reed, early 20s, junior archive clerk. Nervous, kind, and about to become the single most important witness in Colville's history, whether he liked it or not. "Please don't send me back to Lord Morgan," he begged, holding out a cloth-wrapped ledger like it might burn him. I took it. Not the king. Me. That mattered. And Milo's shaking hands relaxed a fraction when he saw it register on my face. "He ordered the old consort's appeals destroyed," Milo whispered. "Not all of them burned." I opened the ledger. Delivered appeals, withheld appeals, fragrance assignments, intercepted letters, all marked in Vincent Morgan's tidy hand, and in the margin of one page, a second handwriting, shaky, desperate, clearly copied in by someone determined that the truth survive even if he didn't. "If His Majesty will not see me, let this record show I did not choose the rights they blame me for." The king read it over my shoulder, and whatever composure he'd been holding on to since I woke up that morning finally, quietly, broke. The corridor outside the Hall of Judgment had transformed in the time it took us to descend from the study. Servants who'd been underfoot all morning had simply vanished, doors shutting soft and fast as we approached, whispers dying mid-word the moment we rounded a corner, the particular, organized silence of a palace bracing for impact. At the first stairwell, a line of attendants blocked the passage entirely, trays and folded linens balanced with theatrical clumsiness, as though someone had staged an accident to slow us down without technically disobeying an order. Adrian stopped. I didn't. I stepped around the trays, lifted the top linen, and found a thin blue cord stitched into its edge, the same blue as Vincent Morgan's ceremonial cords, the same color as the guards he'd repositioned outside my wing that first morning. "He's marking things now," I said, holding it up. "Corridors, objects, people, building a net." Adrian took the linen from my hand with a stillness that read, to anyone who didn't know him, as calm. I was starting to know him well enough to recognize it as the exact opposite. "No one wearing that color enters the eastern wing again," he told the nearest guard, who nodded fast enough to strain something. We kept walking. My heart was doing something complicated and unhelpful in my chest. Not quite fear, not quite the reckless calm of the Bobatia crosswalk, something new stitched from both. 27 years as Noah Bennett had taught me a lot of things, mostly about database architecture and how to avoid eye contact on public transit, and none of it had remotely prepared me for walking toward a rigged tribunal beside a king I'd apparently started falling for some time between breakfast and treason. "You're quiet," Adrian said, glancing sideways. "I'm saving my material for the hall. Gotta pace myself. You are the single strangest person I have ever met. You say that like it's not working out for you so far." He didn't answer that, which I decided, with the specific, giddy stubbornness of a man who'd recently died and had nothing left to lose by being hopeful, counted as a win. A bell began tolling, not the soft chapel bell for prayer, the big iron one that meant council, now emergency. Milo went pale. "He called the council early," he stammered. "The Sunset trial was never real. He's changing the charge." "Changing it to what?" I asked, already knowing the answer would be worse than madness or disobedience. "Enchantment," Milo whispered. "He's saying the consort has bewitched the king." I actually laughed once, short and disbelieving. Of course he was. It was, honestly, the smartest move Vincent Morgan had made all day. Because in a kingdom where Omega monarchs were rare, and every noble in that hall, had spent a lifetime believing an unbonded alpha husband was one bad instinct away from claiming his way onto the throne. Enchantment wasn't just an insult. It was a charge people would believe. "If you defend me," I told the king, watching the pieces click into place on his face at the same speed they had on mine, "he wins. You look controlled. If I defend myself, I'm unstable. If I stay quiet, I confess. There's no version of this where he loses unless we change the rules." The king's jaw tightened. "Then we go in with proof instead of pleading." "Now you're getting it." He almost smiled again. I was going to have to start counting. I walked into the Hall of Judgment alone, ledger under one arm, the king one step behind, close enough to matter, far enough that no one could claim he was pulling my strings. Vincent Morgan stood at the center under the stained glass, staff in hand, a fresh velvet cushion, and a pair of silver restraints laid out like door prizes. "Your Highness arrives without escort," he said smoothly, "refuses restraint and brings unauthorized materials before a formal tribunal. The record will note this." "Good," I said. "I'm tired of records that pretend I wasn't there." I set the ledger on the cushion instead of my knees. "You wanted me kneeling. Let the evidence kneel instead." The counselors, a dozen graying nobles in robes that cost more than my old Portland apartment, leaned forward as I opened it. I read the forged reports aloud. I held up the hidden scraps. I never chose the perfume. They dressed me while I was ill. Please ask me once. I laid the white ribbon on top, the one used to bind the old consort's letters before Morgan ordered them burned, stamped with a forged copy of the king's private seal. "Forged," Vincent Morgan said, but his voice had lost its polish. "Funny," I said. I was about to say the same thing. Lady Prescott, 60s, treasurer of the council, silver-spectacled and famous for never once being fooled by a man's smile. Vincent Morgan had apparently survived 11 years on this council largely by staying out of her way. A silver-spectacled councilwoman took the ledger from my hands, with the reverence of someone realizing she'd been lied to for years. She read the margin note aloud herself, voice dry and precise. And something shifted through the council benches like wind through wheat. A younger lord near the back muttered, just loud enough to carry, "He kept appeal receipts?" from the gardener's flowers, and got shushed by 3 people at once, though not before the damage. Vincent Morgan's petty, obsessive cruelty laid bare in one small, humiliating detail had already landed. Morgan tried a last, desperate pivot, the enchantment charge, the ancient fear of an alpha's scent bending an omega's judgment, the same tired script he'd clearly used 100 times on someone who couldn't fight back. "Ask the council to test it, then," I said, spreading my arms. "Ask them if I smell like manipulation, or if I just smell like a man who's had a very long day." A counselor near the front actually laughed before he caught himself. Even Adrian's mouth twitched, the ghost of a smile he was clearly trying very hard to suppress in front of his own court, and losing. Lady Prescott, still holding the ledger, adjusted her spectacles and said, with the flat, devastating precision of a woman who'd clearly waited years for permission to say it, "Lord Morgan, I would like the record to reflect that in 11 years on this council, I have never once seen you produce evidence that survived a second reading. I am beginning to suspect that is not a coincidence." A ripple of poorly stifled laughter moved through the benches. Morgan's ears went red. Morgan's composure cracked properly then. "This is absurd." "So was accusing a man of enchantment because he asked the king to read his own mail," I said. "Ask why I refused this morning, I'll tell you. Because the moment I woke up in this palace, it tried to dress me in a robe you knew he'd hate, starve me for stability, and call every attempt to survive it misconduct. Ask why the appeals were withheld. Ask why every humiliation only became proof after your office touched the record." I pulled the ring from my finger and set it down on top of the open ledger, deliberate and unhurried, the way you'd set down a card that finished a hand. "You want to talk about what's real and what isn't," I said to Morgan. "Start with this. A ring I never chose to wear, for a marriage I never chose to enter, that your office has spent 6 months using as a leash. I'm done pretending it's a symbol of anything you say it is." The hall didn't so much gasp as inhale all at once, a dozen counselors forgetting briefly how to hold their expressions. The king stepped forward at last, not in front of me, beside me, close enough that Morgan's outstretched hand froze mid-reach for the ledger. "Lord Morgan," Adrian said, and his voice didn't rise, because ice never has to, "is removed from ritual authority, pending trial for forgery, destruction of royal correspondence, and interference with the crown." Morgan opened his mouth, The guards behind him, the ones wearing his blue ceremonial cords, didn't move to help. One by one, up and down the hall, those cords came off like snakes shedding old skin. I have never, in either of my lives, enjoyed a man's face falling apart quite that much. The king picked up the ring, my ring, from where I'd set it on the ledger during the confrontation, but he didn't force it back onto my hand. He just held it out, palm open, between us, in front of the entire kneeling court. "This belongs to you only if you want it," he said, "and if you don't, the palace will still answer for what it did." That was the apology, not the word sorry, a choice offered instead of demanded, in front of every noble who'd ever whispered dramatic behind my back. I looked at the ring, at the scraps of desperate handwriting still fanned across the cushion, at a man, the original Elliot Parker, who'd tried, in his own shaky script, to make sure someone someday would finally believe him. I didn't take it. Not yet. "I'll let you know," I said, and set it back down on the ledger, and the entire hall of judgment held its breath, as if a king's husband declining a ring in public were the single most scandalous thing that had happened all day. Which, given the day we'd had, was genuinely impressive. Adrian didn't argue. "Then I'll wait standing," he said, quiet enough that only I heard it, and something in my chest, traitorous, unfamiliar, entirely too fond for a man I'd known for less than a day, turned over like a key finding its lock. That evening my wing had fires again. Real food, tea gone gold with honey. The dry bread from that first cursed breakfast still sat on the tray by the window, one bite missing. I picked it up and just stared at it. 24 hours ago it had been a punishment. Now it felt like proof I'd survived something. A knock came, not a summons, an actual polite knock. "May I enter?" said the king, from the other side of the door, without a crown, without guards, holding a small wooden box against his chest like it might break. I opened it myself. "The appeals that survived," he said, setting the box down on the threshold. "Not inside, on the threshold, as if grief itself needed an invitation to cross. Copies go to the council. The originals are yours." I stepped back to let him in, and he crossed to the window seat. My window seat, the one where Elliot Parker had apparently spent months hiding, the cushion frame cracked and now quietly repaired, a plain wool blanket folded at one end where ceremony had clearly not been invited. "They made it sound pathetic," he said, "that you spent your days here. Was it? No." He looked at our twin reflections in the dark glass. "I think it was the only place in this palace where you weren't performing for anyone." I sat down first. After a moment he sat too, not touching, but close, the specific closeness of two people who have decided, independently and without discussing it, that they'd like to be closer than this eventually. "I haven't forgiven you," I said. "I know. I might not stay. I know that too." His hand rested on the seat between us, empty, no ring, no order in it. "Then let it be earned. Tomorrow. And the day after, until protection stops being another word for control, in your mouth or mine." I turned toward the window so he wouldn't see exactly how much that sentence had wrecked me, and caught, in the reflection, the ghost of Elliot Parker's exhaustion finally easing off my face. We sat like that a long while, the fire ticking low behind us, the box of surviving letters resting unopened on the table, because some grief needs daylight before you can face it properly. Adrian didn't fill the silence, which I was starting to understand was its own kind of gift, from a man who'd spent a lifetime being told silence was weakness. "Can I ask you something?" I said eventually. "That has nothing to do with ledgers or treason? That would be a novelty today. Why didn't you ever just read the letters before all this? You had them. They were right there." He was quiet long enough that I thought he might not answer at all. When he finally did, his voice had lost the careful, measured edge it wore in council chambers, gone rough and unguarded in a way that felt like a door left open on purpose. "Because I was told, from the week we married, that you were unwell, dramatic. That reading your letters would only encourage it." His jaw worked once. I believed a report instead of a person, because a report never made me feel guilty for 6 months of silence. A person might have. That's genuinely one of the saddest things I've ever heard, and I once watched my roommate cry over a canceled pizza order. That startled a real laugh out of him. Short, surprised, entirely unroyal, the kind of sound that made something in my chest go warm and stupid and entirely too fond. "I don't understand half of what you say. You will. I'm very patient." "Well, I wasn't this morning with the robe, but generally." He turned to look at me properly then, close enough that I could see the exact gray of his eyes catch the firelight, close enough that the space between us had stopped being distance and started being a decision neither of us had made yet. "Elliot," he said, my name or the name I was wearing, spoken like he was trying it on for the first time and finding it fit better than expected. "Yeah, I would like to kiss you. I am aware that is an absurd thing to want, given the day we've had. It's been an extremely chaotic day," I agreed. "Extremely chaotic day for a first kiss. Is that a no? That is an are you going to ask again or just stand there being dramatic about it?" He kissed me before I finished the sentence, which felt fair, all things considered, and it was nothing like I'd have guessed from a man built entirely out of ice and unread mail. Careful at first, questioning, like he expected me to change my mind, and then not careful at all once I very clearly hadn't. His hand found my jaw, warm despite the cold study, and I felt something in my chest that had nothing to do with grief or ledgers or a boba tea 3 lifetimes ago. Just the simple, uncomplicated fact of wanting to stay exactly where I was. When we broke apart, he looked faintly, wonderfully undone, hair mussed where my hand had apparently ended up without my permission. And I decided then and there that I was going to spend the rest of whatever life I had left, finding new ways to put that exact expression on Adrian Blackwood's face. "For the record," I said, a little breathless, "I'm still not putting the ring back on tonight. I have standards." "Insufferable," he muttered, but he was smiling, actually, fully smiling, an expression the court had apparently never once been allowed to witness, and pulled me back in before I could gloat about it properly. Outside, no summons came, no perfume, no cushion. Nobody asked me to prove I deserved to be at peace. I fell asleep on that window seat an hour later, upright, half-leaned into a king who hadn't moved either, and if his hand happened to end up laced properly through mine by morning instead of a careful, deliberate inch away, well, nobody wrote that into any record. For once, some things in that palace got to stay just ours. 3 weeks later, in front of the same council that once tried to end him, Elliot Parker put the ring back on his own hand, unprompted, mid-sentence, in the middle of an unrelated budget meeting, purely to watch Adrian Blackwood lose his train of thought in front of 11 very confused ministers. It worked. Some victories are worth waiting for. 6 months into marrying an actual king, properly this time, with vows we both meant, I have learned exactly 3 things about Adrian Blackwood that the entire kingdom does not know. 1. He cannot cook. At all. Not needs practice, but genuinely, structurally cannot cook, to the point where our kitchen staff have a standing rule that His Majesty is banned from the stove between the hours of dawn and midnight, which is, notably, all of them. 2. He is, despite ruling an entire kingdom with an iron will and a face carved from granite, extremely ticklish behind the left ear, a fact I discovered by accident and have since weaponized shamelessly in council meetings that run too long. 3. He still keeps the ring box, the little wooden one full of a dead man's desperate letters, on his desk, not locked away, just there, like a reminder he chooses to look at on purpose. "You're staring," Adrian said one morning, not looking up from a trade report, sunlight cutting gold stripes across the study floor. "I'm admiring. There's a difference. You said that about the robe. It was, in fact, a curtain. I contain multitudes." He finally looked up, and, 6 months in, married, bonded, thoroughly and mutually smitten, that look still did something unfair to my pulse every single time. "Some things, apparently, don't wear off. Jamie tells me," he said, setting the report down with the specific care of a man about to enjoy himself, "that you bribed the kitchen with an extra hour off to make you American pancakes at midnight. They were incredible. You should try one before you judge." I judged the flower on the ceiling. That was one time, and it was Jamie's fault for laughing during a crucial flipping moment. Jamie Collins, no longer 19 and nervous, now 20 and slightly less nervous, promoted to head page and enormously pleased with himself about it, poked his head through the study door at the sound of his own name. I regret nothing. It was the funniest thing I've seen since Lord Morgan tripped over his own robes at sentencing. "He did not trip," Adrian said. "He was pushed. Gently. By irony. By Elliot's foot," Jamie corrected, and ducked out before I could throw a quill at him. Milo Reed, promoted to chief archivist after that whole ledger business, and still, 6 months later, weirdly proud of it, had taken to leaving me increasingly elaborate thank you notes hidden in state documents, which meant Adrian occasionally opened important trade correspondence to find a doodle of us both wearing crowns made of tapioca pearls, because I had, at some point, told Mull the entire boba tea story, and he had never once let it go. The harvest festival in Ravenswood had come and gone the week before, and I still hadn't stopped hearing about it. It's a long-standing tradition, apparently, for the royal consort to walk the market square and greet the merchants personally, a tradition Elliot Parker had never once been permitted to observe, because someone in Vincent Morgan's old office had quietly rescheduled it around him for 8 straight months. This year, Adrian walked the whole square beside me, hand loose at the small of my back, glaring, actually glaring, King of Colville level glaring, at any stall owner who so much as hesitated before serving me. "You're doing the face," I told him, elbow deep in a barrel of candied chestnuts a very enthusiastic vendor had insisted I sample. "I don't know what face you mean. I will personally audit this man's taxes if he looks at my husband wrong face. That is simply my natural expression. Your natural expression used to be ice sculpture contemplating a lawsuit. This is new. This is jealous. I am not jealous of a chestnut vendor. You bought out his entire cart, Adrian, for the kingdom's benefit. Winter provisions, it's 1 cart of chestnuts in front of my face." He didn't dignify that with a response, which was by now how I'd learned to recognize when I'd won an argument outright. Old Tomas the baker, watching from his stall with undisguised delight, had taken to calling it His Majesty's Alpha problem behind his back, loud enough that I always heard it, and Adrian, mercifully, never quite did, even Mrs. Whitmore had thawed, in her way. She still ran the household like a filing cabinet with opinions, but the fires in my wing had never once gone cold again, and last week she'd left an entire tray of honeyed tea outside our door, with a note that just said, "For both of you, try not to burn the kitchen down." Progress in Colville apparently looked exactly like being trusted with pancakes. There was, I should mention, the small matter of the bonding mark, an alpha-omega tradition Adrian had explained to me, with the stiff, over-formal seriousness of a man reciting something from a textbook he found deeply embarrassing, about scent and permanence, and a bite at the junction of the neck that apparently made the whole arrangement biologically, magically official. I'd made exactly one joke about it being medieval Wi-Fi pairing before he threatened, with commendable sincerity, to have old Tomas stop sending pastries to my study. I'd behaved for almost a full week after that. The bonding itself happened quietly, months after the wedding, in the same window seat where everything else important between us had happened. No council, no court, no velvet cushion in sight, just candlelight and his mouth against my throat, and a warmth that settled into my chest and stayed there permanently, humming low under my skin like a second, steadier heartbeat. Afterward, every servant in the palace developed a sudden, suspicious talent for finding reasons not to interrupt us for entire afternoons at a time, which I considered the single greatest diplomatic achievement of Adrian's reign. It also meant that, 3 weeks later, during a council session about grain tariffs that had already run 90 minutes too long, I caught Adrian's scent shift, subtle, only noticeable to me now, a faint spike of something sharp and possessive, the exact moment Lord Ashby, a minor noble with more ambition than sense, leaned a little too familiarly close while making a point about southern trade routes. "You're doing the face again," I murmured, leaning over under the pretense of reviewing a document. "I have no face." "You have several faces, and this is the considering treason charges over proximity one. Lord Ashby is discussing tariffs. Lord Ashby is discussing tariffs very close to my ear, apparently, based on your pulse right now." Adrian didn't dignify that with a response, though the council meeting concluded, remarkably, 4 minutes later, a personal record, according to Milo, who kept unofficial statistics on such things purely for his own entertainment. That evening, we ended up back on the window seat, the same one, cushion recovered twice now in fabrics. Adrian insisted on choosing himself, which is how I discovered a king with excellent taste in political theory and genuinely baffling taste in throw pillows. "I've been thinking," Adrian said, resting his head against my shoulder in the specific, unhurried way that still made something warm and stupid bloom behind my ribs. "Dangerous, about what you said, the first morning, that I never met you on a day you weren't being pushed into something. I remember, I was very charming about it. You were insufferable." A pause, his hand finding mine on the cushion, no ceremony, no audience, just 2 men who'd fought an entire corrupt court to get exactly this. "I'm glad I finally met you anyway." Outside, Ravenswood settled into evening the way it did every night now. Lanterns lighting one by one along the Blackstone River, distant laughter drifting up from the market square, where old Tomas was undoubtedly still complaining good-naturedly about his depleted chestnut stock. The whole city humming along in a rhythm that had nothing left in it of cold breakfasts or sealed wings or velvet cushions worn thin from kneeling. The palace was quiet in a way it had never once been cruel. No summons waited on the nightstand. No perfume he hated. Just an alpha who'd died over spilled boba tea, an omega king who'd learned the difference between ruling and controlling, and a very lopsided stack of pancakes cooling on a plate between them, because apparently even happily ever after needed a midnight snack. Jamie found us there 20 minutes later, under the flimsy pretense of delivering a message that could easily have waited until morning, took one look at the two of us tangled together on the cushions with a cooling plate of pancakes between us, and turned right back around without a word, though not before I heard him mutter something to Milo in the hallway about collecting on a bet, which meant, apparently, half the household staff had been running odds on us for weeks. I decided not to ask who'd won, mostly because I suspected the answer involved a pool I hadn't been invited to place money in myself. For the record, I said, I'm still not kneeling for anyone, ever again. Adrian huffed something that was almost a laugh against my shoulder. Good. I never wanted a husband who kneels. I wanted one who stays standing next to me. Sap. Insufferable, he said again. Fonder this time, and I decided, with the particular, settled certainty of a man who'd already died once and gotten an unreasonably good second chance, that I could live with being called that for the rest of however long this life lasted. Somewhere down the hall, faintly, I could hear Jamie losing an argument with Mrs. Whitmore about curfew for the palace hounds, and Milo humming off-key while he reshelved a box of very ordinary, very unforged records, and the whole ridiculous, hard-won little world we'd built out of a bad marriage, and a worse conspiracy, settled quietly around us like it had always meant to end up here. If any part of Elliot and Adrian's story stayed with you, tell us in the comments which moment hit you the hardest. We genuinely read everyone. Give this video a like and subscribe so we know to keep these stories coming. Thank you for spending this time with us, truly.